It turns out that the humanoid found in the Atacama Desert that's featured in the Sirius documentary might not be as uncommon as we thought. And a new book on Ripley of Ripley's Believe It or Not, it includes an image from 1933 of another tiny mummified carcass. Lee Speigel of the Huffington Post has been researching and writing about this story. We got in touch with him to talk more about it. Okay, well, we're lucky enough to have Lee Speigel of the Huffington Post Weird News here, and you've got a new weird story about another carcass, little carcass found in the Atacama Desert.
Well, I can't get enough of those stories about other carcasses, you know?
Yeah, carcass stories. Desert carcass. That's going to be us pretty soon out here in Arizona. It's so hot you almost feel like you're going to shrivel up.
So in other words, in the future, instead of calling you Alejandro, I'm going to start calling you Atacama.
Right, exactly. So yeah, tell us a little bit about your new discovery here.
Well, you know, it wasn't even really my discovery. A few weeks ago, I got an email from one of my readers who said, "Hey, Lee, have you seen this picture?" And he sent me a little kind of blurry picture that showed the famous millionaire entrepreneur of the 1930s named Robert Ripley, who created Ripley's Believe It or Not. It's a picture that showed him from 1933 with his hand outstretched, and standing in his hand was this little 6-inch humanoid. And I went, what? And the caption underneath it referred to this little guy as Attaboy. And I went, what? Because I had just come off of writing 3 stories about the controversy about a little guy 6 inches tall called Atta, who was featured in the very controversial documentary that recently came out called Sirius.
Who also turned out to be a boy.
Who also turned out to be a boy, yeah, and definitely human, okay, not alien. But the coincidences started to get to me. I thought, well, wait a minute. Here are 2 6-inch tall young men. Both have the word Atta in their names. One is Atta, the other was Attaboy. The Atta that was in the film Sirius was only discovered about 10 years ago that we know of, in 2003, somewhere in the Atacama Desert of Chile. And he found his way through many hands, literally many hands, until he found his way into the hands of Dr. Stephen Greer, who put Atta into this documentary. And as you know, Alejandro, lots of DNA analysis was performed on this young boy, humanoid creature, however you want to refer to it, until it was discovered that enough DNA analysis indicated it was human. But there was still controversy over this because one scientist of excellent credentials would say, well, this was probably maybe an unborn fetus that was involved with an aborted birth, an abortion. And then another person would say, like the scientist you interviewed at Stanford, who said it was definitely human, but it probably lived to be 6 or 8 years. Well, you can't have it both ways. Either it was an aborted fetus, or it wasn't. And you've got this coming from scientists of probably equal credentials. So the mystery is still there. But then now we have another mystery because now there seem to be 2 Attas. The first one I was talking about came from Chile, but Attaboy was supposedly from Bolivia. And the story was that it was the unfortunate victim of the Jivaro Indians of that time in the 30s, who enjoyed shrinking mostly the heads of people. But there's a possibility that maybe he was one of the few whose entire body was shrunk. So there are a lot of things that we don't know about. After the 1930s, Attaboy vanished. And so we don't know, even the Ripleys, believe it or not, people would like to find out whatever happened to Attaboy. I think it would be really amazing if someone could actually find his whereabouts, take some DNA samples, and compare Attaboy's DNA with Atta.
Now, yeah, the Ripley people from your story seem to feel that Atta and Attaboy are essentially, you had written cousins, but essentially they
Yeah.
feel that he was also from the Atacama Desert and
Yes, yes.
probably also not a shrunken body, but probably a fetus is what I think a Ripley representative said.
Yeah, exactly. And again, whatever Attaboy turns out to be, they all believe in the Ripley organization that it was Ripley himself who nicknamed the young boy Attaboy
Hmm.
to indicate that, well, he came from the Atacama Desert. I just thought it was an amazing coincidence. And here are these two little 6-inch guys that are separated by 70 years. And all of a sudden they just start, they show up,
Yeah,
in the public eye like this.
yeah, and I think they look very similar. I mean, in many ways. I mean, in composition and size, and the skulls are a little different. But just like in the report from one of the scientists, they believe that the skull of Atta was crushed post-mortem.
Yeah.
And so the skull in Attaboy doesn't look crushed, and that would account for the differences in the skulls. Do you think they're essentially probably the same thing? I'm not.
I don't know. As I really look at them very closely, I notice in Attaboy there appear to be like almost painted on eyebrows. Well, maybe that's something that the Jivaro Indians would have done to people, who they killed and then shrunk. Maybe it was part of their ritual. I'm told by the Ripley's people that the Jivaros only shrunk the heads of their enemies because they felt that it was more important to keep and capture the head because the head contained the soul of their enemy. Plus, apparently, and I didn't know this until recently, it's very difficult to take an entire body and shrink it in proportion because the bones do not shrink where the rest of the skin does. And so the Jivaro Indians only wanted to keep the head and removed the skull of all of their victims.
Right. So, well, I guess these could be discarded skeleton, maybe. Who knows, huh?
Or you know what? Like, and you and I have been talking to scientists who are. I think the phrase that seems to be coming around and making the most sense is mummified fetus.
Yeah, I think you keep getting more, and online there's been a couple other experts to say that, in their mind, no doubt, that that's exactly what they've seen before. It's a mummified fetus.
Yeah.
So
it's still amazing. And,
yeah.
and in fact, the Ripley's people, through my story, are soliciting the readers to help them.
Right.
It's like now, instead of the readers being armchair critics, now they can become armchair detectives.
Well, how did they lose Attaboy? How did it get away from him?
They are so surprised. When you talk to the people of the Ripley organization, they're amazed that Ripley himself didn't somehow acquire Attaboy from the people who supposedly owned him back in the 1930s, because he was a millionaire. He had the money, and this was his quest in life, was to travel the world and to find and buy and put on display the most odd-looking curiosities that he could find around the world. But for some reason, he didn't purchase Attaboy, even though he posed with Attaboy. In my story, I show a series of pictures that show Ripley holding Attaboy. Ripley was dressed in like a black tuxedo and a white dinner jacket. I mean, he was really into Attaboy.
Yeah, he liked that little fella.
Yeah, he did. And so it's a mystery. The Ripley people said that Ripley never left any notes behind of who actually owned Attaboy and where Attaboy may have ended up, and whether he's still even in somebody's private collection. So I'm helping them to try and find Attaboy with the help of the readers, and we'll see what happens.
And where was it? It was actually in the States where they lost track of Attaboy. Is that correct?
Yeah. In fact, the pictures that were taken of Ripley and Attaboy were from the very first Ripley museum, well, they like to call them the Ripley's auditoriums. They now have 32 of them around the world. But the first one they opened at the 1933 Chicago World's Fair. And that's where these pictures of Ripley and Attaboy came from. But the story goes that Attaboy was on loan to Ripley by a company in possibly Salt Lake City. And it looks like it might have been a bank company called, I think it was called the Central Bank. But that's where the trail ends. Again, nobody knows what happened to Attaboy.
Yeah, well, let me ask you about some of the controversy that you were touching on earlier,
Yeah,
because Attaboy, they're not professing it to be anything other than human.
right.
Atta, the DNA expert, and we're not scientists. We need to go by what the experts say, and the expert
Yeah.
says, that in his words, there's no doubt that this thing is human. So people are wondering why we were led to believe in these press releases on the movie that it was something other than human. And I've interviewed some of the film people, and they seem to still think maybe there's hope. Do you think they purposely misled people, which some people are claiming?
I think that that was part of it, Alejandro. How else are you going to sell movie tickets or to get people to go online and to purchase your movie or your documentary unless you get people interested in it? And sometimes I think people will stretch the truth a little bit. And, you and I were talking about it weeks before the movie Sirius was premiered, and we were talking about how, look at these press releases. They're saying that the information about Atta, the DNA analysis about Atta, is going to change the paradigms of science and the world in which we live in. Well, it didn't happen. I don't think any paradigms have changed. Do you?
I don't think the paradigms were nudged or kind
Yeah.
of pushed or influenced whatsoever, unfortunately.
Yeah, but they wanted people to think maybe because the thing looks so alien-like, because our culture wants us to believe that aliens must have elongated, unnatural-looking heads, and must have like weird-looking eyes and ears and whatever, nose and mouth. Well, okay, so suddenly if you find one and it's only 6 inches tall, well, that adds to the mix. That adds to the mystery of it. Um, but still, I mean, I think about when Atta was first found in 2003. One of the first owners was, I believe, a guy who owned a bar in Chile, and he used to make money by letting people pose with Atta. And then he eventually, I believe the story is that he sold Atta for the equivalent of $64.
Mm.
So, I mean, and then it found its way into the hands of former emergency room doctor Stephen Greer, and who, of course, took total advantage of the situation, and yet to put it into a documentary involving other things like UFOs and finding new forms of free energy that could help the planet, it was very convoluted, and Atta kind of got lost. But I still go back to, where are these paradigm shifts that we're all going to experience because of Atta? Well, now we're told, well, 91% of the DNA shows that Atta was human, but because of the 9% that we're not really sure about, we need about another year of analysis. Well, I say that they released the movie prematurely. They wanted to get a jump on it. Maybe they wanted to get a jump on Attaboy. Maybe somebody knew that Attaboy was about to hit the the publicity circuit himself.
I think it's kind of funny that both of these little guys have, in their afterlife, been used for marketing purposes, this whole time, either by Ripley or by the bar or by the Sirius people.
I know. It's like, what does it say about the human condition? Or maybe it doesn't say anything about the human condition. But yeah, you're right. Both little guys, as amazing as they are, and we'd love to know more about either one of them, they end up being a marketing tool for something.
Yeah. And I mean, John Alexander, who, he's an expert on non-lethal weapons, a very important person right now in the defense industry, and he wrote about Atta. He wrote a blog on Huffington Post, and he made an interesting point I wanted to see if you agreed with, which is, when this happens, this is just another example kind of a big claim coming from UFO believers or researchers that doesn't pan out. It makes a big splash with the media, and then the public sees that this is another claim that doesn't come to fruition. Do you think that's damaging?
I think it's damaging only if any amount of, and even the slightest amount of credibility is taken away from the overall picture. And I think that they lost some credibility first, with Atta, because of the claims or the inferences, the implications that they said that Atta would have on everybody, but that didn't pan out. And so to me, if something isn't totally credible, then you're in trouble. It'll come back to bite you on your rear end where it really hurts. It seems to me like maybe the only real credible person involved with the whole Atta thing was Dr. Gary Nolan, the one who did all the DNA research.
Who's been honest and straightforward, and he,
Yeah.
even in my interview, said, he kept an open mind, and he was surprised that people were really interested to talk to him, even when his results were more mundane. And that 9% he talks about is more related to error, and I'm going to get him to clarify that a little bit, hopefully in an upcoming interview. But I think people are misunderstanding the science. It's very complicated.
It is, and I feel badly for the people who are the true believers, who wanted to believe that this had to be some result of an alien exploration of Earth, and we couldn't find these aliens because they're only 6 inches tall.
Right.
And easy for them to hide in the jungles and the deserts of South America.
There could be one in the corner of the studio here.
Yeah, I saw a couple today here in New York.
So finally, I want to ask, I don't think we've heard this or you've written much. What is your final then opinion of the Sirius film overall now, given Atta and given the other, because the film's about a lot more than just the Atta creature.
Yeah, I was disappointed. And I went into it, as most people did who saw it, I went into it wanting to see something amazing that would make that light bulb appear over my head and say, wow, this is really amazing. I feel like my paradigm has just shifted. But that didn't happen. I think that there were too many things in the movie that should not have been there, that had nothing to do with what I felt was the credibility of changing paradigms and extraterrestrials and UFOs. I just didn't think that there was enough of that. It should have been a scientific documentary, plain and simple. Let's do like the whole hour. In fact, the documentary was just under 2 hours, and yet it just kind of got convoluted, and that's why I was disappointed. I would really like to see a documentary that just goes for the total credibility, the science, filled with scientists. I don't want to see people sitting around outdoors on lounge chairs, closing their eyes, meditating, and calling for aliens from the Pleiades or the dog star Sirius to come down and show yourselves. And oh, we're doing it at night. Let's put on our night vision goggles. It'll help us to see you better. I'm sorry. That has no place in a scientific documentary if that's what you're billing it. And that's one of the problems I had.
Yeah, when you tell people, in your marketing that you're going to change their paradigm, shift their paradigm, then you're setting a pretty high bar. So you can't be even a good movie. You've got to blow people's minds, or else you're going to be letting people down.
I agree. If they had just stuck to the whole premise of there are alternate forms of free energy that the government is not telling us about because big business doesn't want us to know about it, blah, blah, blah. We can use all kinds of energy to power our vehicles, our industries. Well, yeah, show us more of that. That's fascinating. That is something that could change paradigms, but they only took it so far. Give us really strong examples. Oh, we don't have strong enough examples of that yet? Then don't put it in a documentary. Show us the stuff that's available and that we can right now, go with it.
Right.
But they didn't do that. I felt it was mostly hype, and a disappointing hype.
Yeah. So is this it for Atta? We've done a lot of stories on Atta and interviews on Sirius, and this might be it, huh?
Well, unless you and I can come up with a way of finding Atta girl and Atta dog.
Yeah.
They must be out there somewhere.
Yep. So keep an eye out, people.
Yep, I agree.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking some time out there, out in Manhattan and the offices of Huffington Post. It's always exciting to think of that.
Well, see, but I sit here thinking it's exciting to think about where you are. So,
Yeah, exactly. Grass is always greener.
It's nice to see you, Alejandro.
Yep, good seeing you too. With the discovery of another tiny mummified body in the Atacama Desert, perhaps it's not so uncommon a phenomenon, certainly not unworldly. Maybe if the Sirius documentary promoters wouldn't have set our expectations so high, we wouldn't have felt so let down, especially when their expert determined that it was only human. Speaking of their expert, we're going to be talking to Dr. Gary Nolan in the next couple days, so stay tuned to openminds.tv for more.